Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
Story 1. I accepted a welcome home gift from my new neighbor. It taught me how to die. Liam and Sarah had stretched every dollar to buy the small, two-bedroom colonial in Willow Creek. It was a fixer-upper, but it was theirs. And the second bedroom, freshly painted in soft gray and blue, was ready for their 6-month-old son, Noah. The neighborhood seemed quiet, perhaps too quiet, a perfect place for a young family to finally settle. The day after they moved in, a knock came at the door. Standing there was Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor from the imposing, overgrown Queen Anne house next door. She was small and intense, her eyes possessing a disturbing, unwavering focus. She didn't offer a cake or flowers. She presented a colossal, hand-carved vintage wooden rocking horse. It was antique, painted a deep chipped red, with glass eyes that seemed unnervingly lifelike, almost staring. "A gift for the little one," she announced, her voice a reedy whisper. "It belonged to my resident from many years. It needs a child to be near again." The word resident hung oddly in the air. The horse was enormous, too large really for Noah, but Liam, trying to be neighborly, accepted. He and Sarah wrestled the heavy thing upstairs and placed it in Noah's nursery, positioning it against the far wall, a good 4 feet from the crib. The next morning, Sarah was the first to notice. "Liam, did you move the horse?" she asked, pouring coffee, her brow furrowed. "No, why?" "It's closer to the crib. I specifically remember putting it by the window." Liam laughed it off, chalking it up to new mom exhaustion. They were both tired and the room was cluttered. But the next morning, it was closer still, now barely 3 feet from the crib. They stared at the base of the rockers, where Liam had unconsciously left a scuff mark on the hardwood floor. The horse was a full 6 inches past the mark. Given the sheer weight of the antique horse, this was deeply unsettling. It wasn't something that could be bumped by a stray elbow or shifted by a draft. That night, Liam explicitly placed masking tape on the floor, outlining the exact position of the horse. The next morning, the red tape was visible. The horse was resting squarely on the edge of the tape, having advanced another 4 inches. Terror began to creep in. Sarah insisted it was haunted, perhaps by the ghost of the neighbor's deceased child. Liam, a man of engineering logic, refused to believe it. They both stayed up one night watching a cheap nanny cam stream on Liam's phone. Hour after hour, the static shot of the crib and the horse remained fixed. They finally fell asleep around 3 a.m., exhausted. When they woke, the horse was a foot away from the crib. Its glass eyes, in the dim morning light, seemed to stare directly at Noah's sleeping face. Liam, now deeply shaken, upgraded the nanny cam to a sophisticated security camera that recorded motion and heat signatures. The camera recorded the entire night. They reviewed the footage at 3x speed. Nothing. No door opened, no shadow crossed the frame, and no thermal anomaly was detected. And yet, the horse had moved. The physics of the situation seemed impossible. The following night, they tried to move the horse downstairs. It was impossibly heavy, refusing to budge even a centimeter. They left it, feeling defeated and paranoid. They took turns sleeping in Noah's room, watching the motionless horse. Sarah, desperate, started researching Mrs. Peterson. She found a decades-old newspaper clipping. Mrs. Peterson, then in her 30s, had lost her only child, a daughter named Eliza, in a house fire. More chillingly, the article mentioned a restraining order she was served years later after harassing a new family who moved into a house 3 towns over. She had become obsessed, claiming the new baby in that house was Eliza reborn. Liam realized they were dealing with something far worse than a ghost. They were dealing with intense, psychopathic human obsession. He started examining the floor again, not for movement, but for mechanics. The horse was now only 18 inches from the crib. He noticed the tiny, almost non-existent gaps in the baseboards near the wall shared with Mrs. Peterson's house. Getting a powerful flashlight and a thin probe, he found what he was looking for. 2 microscopic screw heads securing a small section of baseboard. He gently pried the board away. Hidden underneath, running across the floorboards and disappearing into a perfectly drilled hole the size of a pen, was a taut, waxed steel cable. The cable was anchored deeply into the massive wooden base of the rocking horse, secured to its central rocking mechanism with hidden hardware. It wasn't haunted. It was being pulled. Liam followed the line of the cable down to the basement. It ran under the floor joists and through the thick plaster of the shared wall. He burst through his own basement door, ran into Mrs. Peterson's yard, and climbed through the unlocked door of her damp, cobweb-filled basement. There, attached to the cable, was a complex, silent hand-crank winch secured firmly to the concrete floor. Beside the winch was an old antique grandfather clock. Liam realized she wasn't using a timer. She was simply turning the crank a few times an hour, using the silence of the night to pull the horse and the crib across the floor slowly, invisibly. The absolute, bone-deep horror came when Liam looked at the wall where the cable disappeared. Mrs. Peterson had disguised the area on her side with an ornate, framed painting. He tore it down, his hands bloodying on the edges of the frame. It revealed not a small drilled hole, but a man-sized, jagged opening in the drywall framed by crudely tacked-up pieces of sheet metal sharpened to a razor-like edge. The horse wasn't being pulled to the wall. It was being pulled to the opening. The baby's crib was only inches away from being dragged past the threshold into the darkness of Mrs. Peterson's cellar. Liam didn't wait. He yanked the cable free from the horse, the tension immediately snapping like a cord on an instrument. He called the police, the line shaking in his hand, realizing that the horror wasn't the slow, silent movement of an object, but the slow, silent precision of a monstrously disturbed human mind planning a meticulously engineered abduction under the guise of neighborly kindness.
Story 2. The Eviction. I bought a foreclosed house haunted by an unsolved murder. They didn't leave. Alex, a freelance web designer constantly battling rising city rents, saw the listing for the house at 42 Elderwood Lane and felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. It was listed for 1/5 of its value. The reason? It was the site of the infamous Vance double homicide, a brutal, unsolved murder 3 years prior. Mr. and Mrs. Vance had been found dead, and their killers were never identified. Alex bought it anyway, rationalizing that the price was worth the ghosts. The house was enormous, and the savings were a lifeline. The dread started immediately upon moving in. The house had a pervasive, suffocating stillness. The neighbors avoided eye contact, looking away every time Alex went to fetch the mail. And then the sounds began. They were always the same: A sudden muffled shout or argument coming from the living room, quickly cut off, followed by a heavy, rhythmic dragging sound that seemed to travel across the attic floor, and sometimes, late at night, a low, ragged, muffled breathing coming from the ductwork. Alex was disturbed, but professionally intrigued. This was a classic residual haunting, the echo of violence indelibly stamped on the structure. Alex played recordings of the sounds to friends, convinced they were non-threatening loops of the night the Vances died. Spooky, yes, but not dangerous. Alex was convinced they were safe because ghosts only repeat the past. A few weeks in, the predictability shattered. The dragging sound in the attic changed. It was no longer the heavy, dull thud of a body. It was a lighter, more metallic scraping, like steel being moved over dry wood. The muffled voices shifted from a fearful argument to a low, intense murmur of commands, too quick to decipher, but clearly contemporary and directed. "The house is changing its tape," Alex told their friend Maya over the phone, trying to sound amused, but the fear was real. Alex felt constantly observed, a cold, prickling sensation on the back of the neck that didn't feel supernatural, but predatory. One afternoon, a local retired sheriff named Dale stopped by, pretending to collect for a charity. He wasn't friendly. "That house is poisoned, kid," Dale warned, his eyes scanning the windows. "The Vances were well known, and whoever did that job was professional. They didn't just kill, they used that house. A house like that doesn't just hold on to a memory, it holds on to the people." Alex's sense of security crumbled. The noise now focused entirely on the attic crawl space, specifically the furthest, darkest corner above the master bedroom. It was a constant, irritating, low-frequency grinding, the sound of someone meticulously working with power tools, or perhaps disassembling something. Alex was convinced the killers had hidden the victim's remains there, and the ghost was the victim desperately trying to make noise. Driven by a desperate need to dispel the presence and reclaim the house, Alex procured a heavy sledgehammer and a pair of industrial gloves. That night, after the metallic sound started again, Alex climbed the attic ladder, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The sound was coming from a sealed-off plywood panel deep in the rafters. "No more residual," Alex muttered, raising the sledgehammer. With 3 violent swings, the plywood panel splintered open, revealing a hidden compartment between the roof trusses. Alex shone the light in, expecting to see bone or rusted clothes. Instead, the light fell on a large, black, custom-fitted, airtight plastic case. It wasn't old, it was pristine. Alex pulled it out, heart hammering against his ribs. It was too heavy to be a skeleton. Alex forced the latches open. The contents weren't victims, but weapons. Inside were 2 unmarked high-powered assault rifles, several magazines, a large block of plastic explosives sealed in vacuum wrap, and a pair of military-grade night vision goggles. The items were all recent, all professionally stored. The realization was a punch to the gut. This house wasn't haunted by the dead. It was a secure staging area for the living, professional killers. The residual haunting wasn't a memory loop of the murder. It was the killers returning occasionally to check their cache, the muffled voices and metallic scraping being the actual sounds of their real-time movements. The house was cheap because the killers had intentionally poisoned the market to keep it empty and available, trusting that the notoriety would scare off most buyers. Alex was not a new owner. They were a very temporary, very expendable caretaker. As Alex stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the evidence, the grinding sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy and final, infinitely worse than the noise. Alex heard it then. The softest, most careful click of the back door latch being deliberately undone downstairs. The killers had come back for their tools. They didn't know Alex was there, but they knew someone had broken into their vault. Alex, now trapped in the stifling heat of the attic crawlspace, dropped the flashlight, sending the beam spinning wildly across the rafters. They fumbled for their phone, dialing 911, the horror mounting as they heard the heavy, slow, living footsteps moving from the kitchen to the base of the attic stairs. Alex wasn't suffering from a haunting. They were undergoing an eviction by the men who owned the secrets of 42 Elderwood Lane.
Story 3. My family tried to move out of our haunted house. The drive never ends. Ben, Chloe, and their 10-year-old son, Leo, had moved into the isolated Victorian rental just 2 weeks prior. The owner, a man named Mr. Finch, had given them a ludicrously low rent, coupled with 2 bizarre, non-negotiable rules. They must never leave the house after midnight, and they must always keep the porch light off. The house was beautiful, but wrong. Doors slammed when no windows were open. Shadows moved against walls that faced total darkness. But the money saved was significant, so they obeyed the rules and ignored the dread. The final straw came when Chloe saw it. Standing in the backyard, she looked up at the attic window. Staring back down at her was the pale face of an old woman with hollowed, dark eyes. Chloe ran inside, but when she checked the house plans, she realized the attic window she saw from that angle did not exist on the exterior of the house. That night, at 1 a.m., driven by silent terror, the family executed their panicked escape plan. They loaded their most essential items into the minivan. Ben started the engine, backed out onto the single, dark country road that led away from the house, and floored it. They drove for nearly 20 minutes, relieved to be away from the dark silhouette of the house. Ben sped past a large, distinct landmark, a centuries-old twisted oak tree, half split by lightning. "We're clear," Chloe sighed, putting her hand on Ben's shoulder. 5 minutes later, the lights of a building appeared in the rearview mirror. As they approached, Ben felt a cold dread clawing up his throat. There was the twisted oak tree again. Then the road curved, and their headlights illuminated their own minivan's driveway. They were back at the house. The porch light was off, just as it should have been, but it glowed with an unsettling, sickly amber light. Panic set in. Ben shouted, reversing violently, turning the car and driving back down the road. They drove faster, ignoring speed limits, laughing hysterically in the tension. 20 minutes, broken oak tree, driveway, back at the house. This continued for hours. They tried every variation, driving slow, driving fast, turning off the headlights, taking the dirt fire trail. Every path led them back to the same porch. The house was an inescapable gravity well, and the world outside was merely a circle designed to herd them back. Ben, his voice rough with exhaustion, suggested they check the coordinates. The GPS was useless, a single blue dot sitting in the middle of a blank, unmapped space. He got out of the car, slamming the door, ready to rage against the structure itself. As he walked toward the overgrown lawn, kicking wildly, he tripped over something low and metallic. A very old, rusted mailbox, completely hidden by weeds. He scraped the rust off. The faded number was 16. He looked back at their current house, the house they had repeatedly returned to. He walked to its functional, relatively new mailbox. The number was 17. He realized sickeningly that they weren't looping back to the same house, but to a similar house sequentially. They were not trapped in space. They were trapped in a chronological sequence of trapped homes. Driven by this new, terrifying hypothesis, Ben drove deliberately, slowly down the road again. This time, he ignored the oak tree and veered violently onto a dense, impassable-looking dirt track through a dense stand of pines. He drove, smashing through brush, until the forest ended abruptly, opening up to a massive, empty field. They stopped, breathing the cool, clean air. They were free. Or so they thought. Chloe, leaning back, checked her phone camera roll. She was looking at the photo she took 2 days ago when they first suspected something was wrong. But her gallery contained not one, but 18 photos of the house's exterior, all taken from slightly different angles, subtly different lighting, and crucially, each house possessing a minute structural difference: a missing chimney, a different gutter line, a unique crack in the porch step. The horror crystallized. They hadn't been driving in a circle. They had been driving through a catalog of the house's victims. Each house was an iteration, a previous attempt at escape that had failed and been cemented into the sequence. They had driven past and returned to the homes of the 16 previous families who thought they were escaping. Ben checked the GPS again. The blue dot was stationary, fixed in the center of the vast, empty field. He looked behind them. In the far distance, barely visible through the mist, stood a single, lonely Victorian home. Number 18. Theirs. It had been transported, dropped in the middle of this non-place, waiting for its next escape attempt. They couldn't drive away again. They were at the end of the road. As the sun began to rise, Ben looked at their own mailbox. The number 18 glowed in the light. They were now the final house in the infinite sequence, the new anchor for the loop. They had driven through the history of the house, and now they had become its newest resident, forever waiting to be driven to by the next terrified family at house 19. The only difference between them and the ghosts was that they hadn't stopped breathing yet. The rent was cheap because the cost was their future. They were the house's last visitors, now its newest permanent exhibit.